Welcome to this exciting interview with Divya Cherian on religion, caste, virtue, unpacking the complexities of South Asian history with Divya Cherian. Firstly, many congratulations on winning the prize for manuscript Merchants of Virtue, Hindus, Muslims, and Untouchables in 18th century India. Divya is a renowned historian whose work focuses on a complex intersection of South Asian history, caste, religion, gender, sexuality, and politics. With a deep expertise in the history of India, Charan is an expert in the study of ways in which caste has impacted Indian society and culture over time. And her work sheds light on the many ways in which we deeply enriched social system had perpetuated inequality and discrimination. As the author of the book Merchants of Virtue, Charan's research offers a unique perspective on the ways in which caste intersects with issues of morality, virtue, and social hierarchy, making her invaluable voice in discussions of social justice and human rights in India and beyond. In this interview, we have the unique opportunity to delve deeper into the mind of this brilliant historian and discover the inspiration behind her groundbreaking research. Get ready to be inspired with informed and inspired by the ideas and insight of the one of the most innovative and exciting voices in the contemporary academia. Without any further ado, let's into the question. So, Ms. Divya, what led you to specialize in the history of South Asia, and what are the some most interesting trends you have observed in the field during your career?
Hi, Heman. Thank you so much for having me on this platform. And thank you even more for that very generous introduction. I almost feel like I don't deserve the kinds of adjectives you used for me, but I will do my best to live up to the expectation you have created for listeners. But thank you so much. I was drawn to South Asian history. Really, it was quite a unplanned move over time. And I would say part of what, sort of helped me make that decision as I proceeded with my education, particularly once I finished my undergraduate degree in Delhi. I sort of, got admission into a great university in Delhi called Jawaharlal Nehru University. And the subject I got admission to, the program I got admission to was history. In fact, at the time, I was trying to escape history because I had done an undergraduate degree in history and I was like, I want to do something else. But the program I got into was history, and it was in that program that I really came to appreciate history as a discipline, mainly because I came to understand a number of things. One of these was that you can choose your own research topic. Now, I know this sounds very obvious, but when you're slowly making your way as a student, from school through college, there is a fixed curriculum, there's a fixed way of getting examined at the end of the semester, the end of the year. I just never had that horizon until this research degree I did this master's degree I did in JNU. So this idea was, I think I realized in a way, there is no limit there are limits, but it's a much wider set of limits than one had initially imagined. So this realization was really exciting to me. The second was this realization that, I think when I speak to young students today, for example, it's very daunting. Okay, what do I want to be? Do I become a sociologist? Do I become a journalist? Do I become a lawyer? And when you're very young, it feels like, oh my God, am I closing off options? How do I know what to become? So I think for me, within the broad parameter of knowing, all right, I'm proceeding down an academic path, I realized that, you can draw methods from anthropology, you can draw ideas from philosophy, or if you're doing anthropology, you can have a historical component. If you're doing history, it can involve art or like art history. For my work, I think I have been inspired by anthropological studies as well as studies of religion. So that realization that there's no fixed boundary, I'm actually not making a final choice in terms of what is my home, was also very liberating. And with that sense of actually this is a wide open canvas, I have a whole set of tools, whatever hat I may wear, on label I may be given, with that kind of realization, it was history that I think excited me the most. And for that, my answer really is, if I think at a subconscious or psychological level, growing up in the city of Delhi, with its multiple, capitals of Delhi, like the built heritage of Delhi that survives into the present and kind of the layers that constitute the city. I think I was always attuned to this deep history of this place. So not even like India or South Asia, but just like the world around me. And I think that little kernel just grew stronger and stronger. And that is what drew me to pre-colonial, pre-modern, when I made that choice in terms of what about South Asia do I want to study.
Yeah, that was really interesting answer because I mean history is something that attracts everyone towards them to dig deep into that even any topic. So with that, your research focuses on the intersection of caste, religion, class, gender, and sexuality politics in South Asia. Can you please speak of some of the key historical events and movements that have shaped these intersections and how they continue to impact contemporary society?
Yeah, I mean, so that is a very vast question, right? Because in a sense, in every moment, all of these different, centers of human relations, gender, sexuality, politics, religion, caste, all these things you mentioned, right? They are constantly interacting everywhere through time. So it's hard to say that there are this or that key moments, but certainly I think if we look back from the perspective of South Asia, I mean, historically, each era has had turning points. So I would say, of course, the very formation of kind of a Vedic Brahminical discourse, in sort of ancient India, followed by the critique of that came from a number of quarters, but the ones that sort of grew the largest were Buddhism, Jainism in the 6th century BCE. The formation of the first large empires, for example, the Mauryan Empire, what that does to dynamics of society, dynamics of gender, dynamics of religion, that was a key turning point, I would say, absolutely. Similarly, I mean, many moments along the way, but economic shifts are important too. The turn to the use of iron, for example, what that makes possible, how that changes society, would be another example. I think that the establishment of the first large Islamic polities in South Asia introduced new forms of taxation, new ways of organizing the state, and also the arrival of Islam into the subcontinent introduced a new dynamic in terms of presenting a counter to caste, which is not to say that Islam at the end is caste free. As Islam, got incorporated into South Asia, we know that every religion that exists in South Asia has, unfortunately, pretty much incorporated caste into its dynamic, whether its theology recognizes caste or not. But still, I would say that the coming of Islam, the coming of Sufism, and kind of this multipolar landscape in the world of religion made possible all kinds of dynamics of caste, gender, and what we call counter-hegemonic expression. When by counter-hegemonic, I mean forms of practice, forms of thinking about the self, forms of being in the world that question dominant ideologies, that question dominant relations of power. These have existed through time, and different shifts along the way have made those possible. So I know this is kind of a wishy-washy answer, but the problem is that these categories are always interacting with each other, and even a further qualification is that these are in a way heuristic categories, meaning it's actually hard to separate religion from politics, from society, from economy. These all blur into each other, but as scholars, we need to kind of, for the sake of our study, define and use these categories, because otherwise it's all sort of one big continuous canvas, right? But there is also a simultaneous recognition that it is something we do for the sake of our study. Actually, there is a lot of bleeding in between all of these different poles that we named, like, again, caste, gender, sexuality, politics, religion. Yeah.
uh, you know, by this I came to know that how beautifully you have connected the dots like the caste, religion, and everything. With that, I have gone overviewed your book Merchants of Virtue, which explores the role of merchants in shaping the social and political change in colonial India. Can you please tell us more about the book? What are the insights you hope readers will gain from reading it?
Absolutely, yeah. And I have it right here. This is, and it's, please note that it's pre-colonial, not colonial India. I'm not sure if I misheard, but I would say that, yeah, I think there are a number of interventions that I hope to make. So, first of all, as the title suggests, with the use of the term merchants, we there is a large amount of scholarship for the period that we call early modern South Asia. So you could say roughly 15th to through the end of the 18th century, is what is this early modern period. So there's a lot of scholarship on the role of merchants in this period, in, for example, running administration, then merchants as traders, merchants as bankers, as financiers, kind of the networks they formed, the financial instruments they used. So there's a lot of scholarship, a good body of scholarship on the economic role and function of merchants, also the political work that they do for states. There's also work that shows how even kings, nobles, people we think of as like royal people or landed people, that they too were dabbling in trade. So that line between merchant and state has been blurred in Indian history writing now for some time. But I think, to me, what I hope to show through this book is how that dynamic of that merchants working with the state, merchants enjoying all of this political and economic power that they come to enjoy from the 15th, 16th century onwards, how that actually also translates into remaking social and religious life. And that is the intervention that I hope to make, which I feel there is not that much work on. There is some work on this from medieval, that is, you could say late medieval, like 8th to 12th century coastal 8th to 14th century coastal polities like Gujarat or coastal South India, because those polities were sea facing and already had that mercantile activity. And so you can see that participation in state and how there are new forms that emerge. But for the mainland, inside hinterland part of South Asia, I hope to make this sort of intervention. And the second intervention that I hope to make is to show that, how for the history of India before colonialism, so before the arrival of the British or the rule by the British, there's a lot of writing about what was the relationship like between Hindus and Muslims. So the older inherited baggage from colonial history writing that continues to haunt all of South Asia into the present is this constructed notion of Hindus and Muslims always having been at war, and this particular demonization of Muslim rulers as being oppressors of the religious freedom of minorities, which is in fact quite relevant for this platform. This construction of the idea of minority into the pre-modern past, even though the idea of a minority comes out of modern discourses. So this idea is the older inherited colonial baggage, which continues to thrive in modern popular discourse and politics. Among historians, however, for the last many, many decades, pretty much soon after independence, there has been a lot of writing that challenges that idea, that seeks to show that no, Muslim, and that's absolutely accurate and important to show that Muslim rulers were not oppressors, and all of this kind of idea of boxes of like Hindu and Muslim kind of operating timelessly as discrete units. This has been challenged repeatedly by generation after generation of historians who have shown that not only was there peace and kind of mutual kind of whatever living together peacefully, but also there were a lot of groups that could not be neatly classed as Muslim or Hindu, cultures, practices, languages, so many things that belong to a shared space that has emerged together such that you cannot say that it was first Hindu or first Muslim. So there's this a lot of important work, which is why I say important is it is what is seeking to undo the conflicts and oppressions we live with in India today on the lines of religion. So in this larger conversation, I hope to build upon that and extend that argument to say that, yes, we often take Hindu and Muslim as a binary pair, right? We take it as a duo, a dyad. Whether we want to say in the older historiography that they are always fighting, or a newer historiography that says that no, they were not. But that dyadic conception remains. So what I hope to introduce into the history of early modern or pre-colonial South Asia is that there's something missing there, a third component, conceptual component, that is that of caste. And that on the ground and historically, how Hindu and Muslim as identities were mobilized, how they were inhabited, how they were lived in the body, was linked to practices and conceptions of caste-based difference, and particularly of the idea of the untouchable. So that difference, that in moments where these communities express that no, we are different from each other, particularly from those who were Hindu, the language that was evoked, the practices that were mobilized were those of caste and untouchability. So I hope to make that intervention regarding early modern South Asian history. And then there are some other interventions as well, but I think I would be droning on. But I think especially for this platform, this question of minorities, I think these are my key interventions.
I mean, your book keeps so many information. I must suggest readers or viewers to do read your book who are really interested into the history. You know, as while going through your book that you shared, I found out that your book focuses on two themes: one idea of the virtue and its relationship to capitalism and social change. Can you please explain how do you conceptualize virtue and why it is important to understand its role in South Asian history?
Thank you. Yeah. So I think with virtue, I mean kind of, a kind of orientation towards a certain morality, like doing deeds that are going to generate some kind of good. So that is a very broad and loose idea of virtue that I was working with. Now, obviously, what is virtuous, what is not, is subjective. That is, it is open to debate, right? What is the value, the moral value, the ethical value that guides what is virtuous and what is its opposite, that is what is a vice, is actually open to debate and open to historical contention. So for a historian, that is for me, that is a question that became clear to me as I was doing my research. So when I started my research, I just had a very broad question of, how did caste operate? How did it change before colonialism? But as I started doing research, I saw that there was a mobilization of kind of ethical stances, being good, doing good. That was a kind of currency in the struggle to remake the caste order. So that is where capitalism comes in. So I'm referring here to the era of sort of commercial capitalism, the kind of background that plays out before the transition to industrial capitalism that happens in the in the decades following in this period. So in this kind of world of like mercantile merchant capitalism, however, this is also not a timeless kind of commercial capitalism. There's a kind of thickening of mercantile and commercial exchange in the course of this period that I keep referring to, the early modern period, right? From roughly the 15th century, you have the voyages of so-called discovery, the Portuguese and Spanish empires. You have this increasing intensification of trade from the 15th century, in which India plays a very important role because of its geographic location and because of the proliferation of various kinds of crafts and artisanal manufacture, particularly textiles, which is an industry that really booms from the 17th century onwards in South Asia as a result of this global demand for trade. So it's not just the manufacturers of textiles, but it is the people who are funding this textile, who are working as intermediaries, who are working as people who give out loans, who are working as people who move money from point A to B long distance. These people are all of mercantile castes or that already exist in South Asia and that experience a huge level in their rise of prosperity or in their levels of prosperity in this period. And it is particularly merchants from Western India, that is Gujarat, and just north of it, Marwar, the region that I study. And Marwar, for listeners who are not in South Asia, is basically like central Western Rajasthan. In fact, not far from India's border with Pakistan today. Just on that eastern edge of the Thar Desert. So these merchants are the immediate beneficiaries of this expanding trade, and it is by the 18th century, that is in the 1700s, that the merchants of Marwar really come to perhaps even outpace merchants from Gujarat in terms of their subcontinental presence in different corners, not only of South Asia, but even beyond. And they, so that kind of, the profit that gets channeled into their hands in this period in the 18th century when the Mughal state is weak, there's no state that can sort of tax that excess wealth from them. There's this kind of prosperity that they come to enjoy. And like I said, merchants from Marwar particularly come to enjoy it. And they have that diasporic connection, ties back home, their natal village, etc., that keeps bringing them back to Marwar. So I argue that this kind of prosperity is then to be followed up with a claim to a higher social rank than they enjoyed at the beginning of this process. So because they are now actually among the wealthiest and most powerful groups within this regional economy, they suddenly have to say that, well, we also should have that kind of caste status. And it is that kind of remaking of the caste status, which can't simply be, you can't just say, hi, I am now high caste. You have to put forward an ideological remaking of the caste order to say, no, somebody of my profession who is not a Rajput, who is not a king, neither is he a Brahmin, he doesn't enjoy that type of currency in the old caste ranking, that there has to be a new logic. And that is where this question of virtue, this question of kind of an ethical practice that justifies the claim to high status and an ethical practice that represents high status. So here, the particular virtue of non-harm, ahimsa, right, which we associate with South Asia today, but that was in particular associated with Vaishnav or Vishnu worshipping, or Jain traditions in India. Again, coming into the early modern period, we already have these as the ethical or virtuous orientations of particular religious communities, again, Jains and Vaishnavas, and of particular caste groups that are part of those religious communities. But in this period, what these merchants try to do is to say that to be vegetarian is a marker of the topmost caste status. And that may seem obvious to those who study caste in South Asia because we associate upper caste status with Brahmins and Brahmins with vegetarianism. But what I want to show is that coming into the early modern period, not all Brahmins are vegetarian. Until today, not all Brahmins, even traditionally, are vegetarian. Kashmiri Brahmins eat meat, Bengali Brahmins eat meat, Konkani Brahmins eat fish. There is animal sacrifice in many Brahmin-led, sectarian practices in South Asia. So there's nothing given about Brahminism and vegetarianism in many parts of South Asia at this time. It is present, but it's not uniform. And I want to point that there are other streams, other social backgrounds from which this quest or this elevation of vegetarianism is coming. And that is the role of the mercantile communities of South Asia. So I would say that is that connection, the kind of economic upward mobility that these merchants enjoy because of shifts in capital flows and their command over the capital flows. How do they square that economic bump up with a caste bump up? That is where I would suggest that in a slow way and not in an intentional planned way, virtue comes to be that ideological justification for now saying that we belong in the uppermost. And for that, they need to even change the logic of caste and add vegetarianism as a marker of high caste status.
You have really beautifully explained that complex concept in easy words. Your work involves most of its issues of gender and sexuality in South Asia. I mean, what are some historical factors that define the gender and sexuality in South Asian history today?
That again, it's a very, very broad question. I can only point to certain moments, certain polls. So first and foremost, there's, we are talking on the eve of Ambedkar Jayanti. So, Ambedkar's foundational critique of Brahminical patriarchy, this idea that from the very earliest, in the very earliest Brahminical texts and Brahminical practices themselves, we can see a correlation between caste and gender oppression, and that these two orders inform each other. And then building on Ambedkar's interventions, many historians have also shown how the oppression of women in different ways for upper caste women and in other ways for lower caste women is interlinked with not just the reproduction of families, who inherits the property. The son inherits or the daughter inherits. Is the daughter herself a form of property? Is the wife a kind of property? So in the reproduction, not just of the family, but in the reproduction of caste, what an important and central role some of the earliest conceptualizations of Brahminism, of legal codes, of again, values, how they shape it, and how that has, in a way, continued over time as one of the poles in the landscape of moral, ethical, legal ideals that inform the everyday operation of Indian society. So one would be that. I think others would be also forms of resistance, that women have mobilized. It is not to say that Brahminical prescriptions governed Indian society without any escape or any departure. So you definitely, there are so many examples of women who, even if they were of low caste background, or even if they were from they were concubines, or they were slaves, or they were widows, they were mothers, or wives, how they came to enjoy political authority. I mean, you have from Razia Sultan to, that, you have 18th century, a whole plethora of women. And that's maybe because we're closer to time. We have so many more records about, this kind of servant woman in a harem in Jaipur, in the inner palace, how she comes to make all important decisions, for example, for the kingdom of Jaipur for a time. So I think, so on the one hand, you have that history of oppression, but you also have evidence for resistance by various women over time. So it's a dynamic.
Yeah. As you mentioned about the caste and sexuality, now how the intersectionality of caste and gender is an important issue to consider when discussing about the issues and experience of Dalits in India. In your view, caste-based discrimination and gender-based discrimination, how does it interact with each other, and how this impacts Dalit women in India particularly?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that, over time, there are different answers to that question. So, for example, in the pre-modern past, in many parts of India, kind of a marker of low caste status, and also a practice of those who were from so-called low castes, people who were from artisanal castes, who made like mochi or dhobi, or various kinds of people who made things. So from those kinds of castes, and from those who we would today call Dalit, there was a practice of remarriage, so that a woman, as soon as she reached marriageable age, she was married, and if her husband died or left her, she would pretty much be expected or pressured to be remarried. So, a historian of the region that I study, for example, has therefore argued that while upper caste women suffered a kind of unfreedom, which was they were not allowed to remarry, because the honor of their caste, the claim to caste superiority of their caste, rested on the idea of their chastity, meaning the idea that they only have one husband in their entire life, and they only have one sexual relationship in their entire life, and that is with their one husband. If that one husband dies, that's it. They have to live as widows for the rest of their lives, if not commit sati, right? But for the women who were not of upper castes, there was a different kind of pressure, which is they had no option but to get remarried. So one cannot get remarried, the other has to get remarried. So it was a different kind of oppression and lack of options, a lack of command over one's own fate that women of the lower caste groups were forced to have. And in fact, if they tried to emulate the upper caste groups' gender practices, upper caste groups would not let them. So they were locked into the oppression that they suffered, and the women of the upper caste were locked into the oppression, a different kind of oppression that they suffered, all in order to assert the elite, the kind of supreme nature of the ones who were dominant. So the currency, the language of expressing status or high caste, one of the key sort of ways of doing that was how your women behave. How do they dress? Can you see them in public or not? Can you see their faces in public or not? Are they allowed to remarry or not? These were, that kind of control was essential, historically speaking. Today, I mean, this is pre-colonial, and it continued in parts of India into colonial and post-colonial. I think today, Dalit women face both patriarchy within the larger social order, within their own families and structures, but they also face the double oppression of caste in terms of everyday forms of discrimination, of humiliation, of kind of structural forms as well. So not just everyday, but inherited inequalities, differential access to education, differential access to healthcare, differential access to ways in which they can make their own destiny. However, here again, I want to add that Dalit women are mobilizing to reshape their own future, to kind of remake society on their own terms, and to carve out a path for Dalit women on their own terms. So this is an ongoing struggle. It is not a story of defeat or resignation, or of upper caste saviors coming and sort of helping the helpless. This is a narrative that one must challenge, that it's not, Dalit women are active agents who are advocating, fighting, organizing, speaking to represent and to work against both caste and patriarchy.
Yeah, you rightfully said that. I mean, women like Yashika Dutt and Charlie Maria Lawrence belong to the lower caste, but speak loudly their thoughts. India is very rich in the tradition, religion, and culture, but we often see that caste is intertwined in India with the religion, with many religion tradition, both refuting and challenging caste-based discrimination. What does role religion play shaping caste relation and experiences Dalits in India?
Yeah, so here also I think I want to point to something I said earlier in our conversation, which is that the idea of religion is in itself a construction of modernity. Even in Europe, this idea of religion has a meaning, the word itself, that has changed over time. So with that caveat in mind, I think when we look at the impact of religion or the interaction between religion and caste, there is a lot of overlap. And I would say that is one of the arguments that I'm hoping to show, not just to tell you that, caste and religion as they operate are interlinked, but to show, through this kind of hopefully textured, detailed, granular history of everyday life that for example, and that's one of the arguments that I'm making in the book, building on what I just told you earlier, is when I said that when we think of Hindu and Muslim, we need to introduce this idea of caste in informing this idea of what it means to be Hindu or Muslim. I'm particularly saying that Hindu-ness is expressed in caste terms in this in the historical context that I study. That is, to make that less abstract, there are particular references I found in which this kingdom, which is run by people of elite castes, Rajputs, Brahmins, and mercantile castes, particularly mercantile castes, who are really ministers, nobles, and administrators, bureaucrats in the whole administration of this kingdom. So these are the people who are writing these records. And in them, I have found examples in which they say, this is a Hindu Okay, Hindus should do something. It doesn't define Hindu, but it does say who is not Hindu, and who should not be allowed to do that thing. And the group with which they contrast who is a Hindu is not Muslim, as perhaps one would expect, but untouchable. And the word used is achep, which means literally untouchable. So the Hindus should do this, and the untouchables should not. And then, very helpfully for the historian, they define what is this untouchable. And that untouchable includes the Muslim in this imagination, and it also includes castes that we would today recognize as Dalit. So this is what I mean, that even at the level of category, Hindu, when they to explain what is Hindu, which also tells us it is not obvious what is Hindu. That is why even the state had to explain to the person who is getting this record who is not welcome in this category Hindu. That in order to remake this category, it had to be spelt out. And so the other that is being described is our groups that we would largely today recognize as lower caste. So that is at the level of idea. But at the level of practice as well, I found many examples in which people said that we Hindus want to do X or Y, but we do not want to let the low, like niche jat is the term used, kameen, which means kamina or working castes. We don't want to let them do this. So Hindu is being actively contrasted in most of my records with lower caste groups named as such, sometimes described as it's against our dharma, which doesn't mean religion. Dharma means like our ethical practice. It is against our marjad, which means maryada, which means it's our prestige. It is. I think there's one example in which, like, we our women would be polluted. The literal Marwadi word, it was bhinta chuti. Okay, that they will be polluted if they are close to these people, and these other people contrasted with the Hindu are lower caste. So I think for me, to go back to your question, for me, it just became increasingly clear that in the early modern context, the term Hindu did not just evoke what we today would understand as a religious identity. It also very much, and perhaps even more so, invoked a caste identity. And then I try to take that towards the end of my book to say that this has consequences for the present, because in the present there was an attempt to kind of present Hindu, or we understand today Hindu as only a religious identity, like which gods do you worship, which festivals do you celebrate. But I want to suggest that this kernel, which is just fresh, it's like in the late 1700s, just before colonialism, it continues. There is a caste basis to Hindu identification that continues into the present, and that's not only a social thing, it continues into the political activities of Hindu nationalist organizations.
Okay, Divya, caste is very much inherited in the people of South Asia. Even we cannot take it out from them. But my question is, have you ever encountered, or any of your friend encountered the caste discrimination in USA or in India?
I mean, yeah, I would say, look, I really think that kind of the way in which all of us from South Asia and in the South Asian diaspora overseas in the West or anywhere else we operate, caste is encoded into our culture, into the way in which we operate. This idea of jhutha, for example, it's not just a hygiene thing. It's not just now again, for those who don't speak Hindi, jhutha is a term that at least in North India it's very clear. Okay, if somebody's saliva has touched something, that is jhutha. Now jhutha means, actually it means liar or something like that. Jhoot means lie. I don't know what connotation or etymology takes it to jhootha, as in somebody's spit or saliva has touched that edible object, and now it has become untouchable, right? I think, so it's not that we are simply saying कि आपको infection हो जाएगा. In today's scientific language, we may say, oh yeah, this is a very scientific understanding to prevent the spread of infections. And in fact, Indians were ahead of the curve in already saying कि don't share food. But there is a ritual and a caste connotation to jhutha as well. I think we would be jumping the gun and having a pseudo-scientific idea that Indians already knew the idea of germ theory before anyone else in the world and secretly had translated it into jhutha, So in those ways, plus if we look in terms of our, the social worlds that we inhabit, people who are of upper caste are very unlikely to have friends, to have interlocutors, to have lovers who are not upper caste. And people who navigate life like that in the modern world think that they do not believe in caste because they never ask their friends their caste. No, their school teacher never meant if you belong to a certain class, you don't talk about caste. In India, you don't talk about it overseas. But if you look around you, the people of lower caste with whom you interact tend to be people who are working for you, who are doing cleaning your house, and people who are working for you and you don't even know it, like keeping your cities running, doing sanitation work, right? I know that in Pakistan there is this increasing oppression based on sanitation work has almost been weaponized, against Dalit communities in Pakistan, and of course that is a pattern we see in India as well, where there is a complete disregard for the lives of Dalits who are forced, are trapped in this kind of work. So I think that caste discrimination is around us, and in our silence and in our lack of self-reflection, we are actually perpetuating it. And I'm not saying that a person can become perfect, kind of above caste discrimination. I think it's a lifelong journey. It's a daily practice. We don't realize the subconscious ways in which we do this, and this is just the subconscious. Then there's the conscious. The conscious way is, number one, arranged marriage. It's so normal. You open any South Asia, there are classifieds and aunties and matchmakers and all kinds of things that make sure that reproduction happens either within a caste or a subcaste, but sometimes within a larger band of upper castes. So I would say that is a very obvious and sitting right there way in which we continue caste discrimination. So I would say caste discrimination is not an isolated and thing you can put in a box ke ha ye parso hua tha, or it happened the day before. It is all around us in a structural way, and that is something I think we need to think about. That said, of course, there are all kinds of more egregious, more spectacular kinds of caste discrimination that I think if you grow up in South Asia, you witness regularly.
I mean, as you mentioned the word isolated, we cannot even isolate the caste. With it, is you are a prominent researcher and author. I must tell you I must ask you what are the effective strategies to address caste discrimination and promote social justice, particularly for Dalits in South Asia and diaspora.
So I think the first and foremost thing is to work as an ally to Dalits. So is not to take this idea, as I said in my earlier answer, that of being a savior. I think the key is to create platforms, to use one's own location to the extent that one has a location, to facilitate the kind of to facilitate scholarship or activism or reform or protest by Dalit intellectuals, activists, and such like. So I think that is my answer in terms of from my location, that I think is an important thing, is to be mindful that one has to work as an ally. And the second is, again, as I said, it's not an easy path, but one has to be kind of conscious and mindful of one's own practice, one's own way of navigating the world. And I hope that, through one's scholarship, as a scholar, I can say, and maybe since maybe many of your listeners are scholars, I think for me to be attentive to caste in answering the questions that we as scholars seek to answer, the research we set out to do. We may think that, oh, I'm just writing a history of, I don't know, mathematics or a history of, painting or something. Well, how is caste relevant here, right? I would say that is the kind of work that one needs to do, is to actually find the ways in which caste does operate in topics, areas, histories we think are sort of not relevant or not related to caste. So for scholars, I would definitely say that. The third is also to, call out those people who erase caste discrimination, who downplay caste discrimination. There's a recent kind of co-option of scholarly writing by Hindutva groups and Hindutva spokespersons saying, oh yeah, caste is just a colonial construct, which is a oversimplification and misrepresentation of post-colonial writing. And so to counter that, and I very much hope that my work can counter this idea that, oh, caste is just recent, British exaggerated it or British made it. But actually, I mean, I really read this in a piece by a Hindutva kind of spokesperson in the US diaspora, that caste was a form of diversity, as though diversity means, equality. You can have diversity with hierarchy and oppression. There is absolutely nothing about diversity that rules out oppression and hierarchy and inequality. So I think, using one scholarship to intervene in the public sphere as well, to counter these kinds of, malicious misrepresentations, I would say. So these are some. I mean, there are it's a multi-front war, or not war, but whatever, campaign or effort, and it's a large one. It's not an easy, quick fix. So these are some of the things that come to mind.
Ms. Divya, as you are the researcher and scholar, there are many organizations and NGOs that are working for the Dalits, Adivasis, and against the caste. Are you a part of any of the organization or the research institute for that?
I'm not part of any organization currently. As a student, I had been an activist in India for my 3-4 years in JNU, and I think that is really where I became attuned. I became alert to the silences about caste, and therefore the ways in which even progressive organizations can perpetuate caste inequality and reproduce caste inequality. And so that really was in terms of like active organization. But other than that, no, I've been part of reading groups. I've been part of scholarly communities that are invested in this question. If students want to reach out to me, I'm available. I sort of, in my teaching, I make it a point to incorporate insights from anti-caste scholarship, to incorporate writings by Dalit intellectuals. So I would say those are the ways, but no, I am not currently part of any organization.
Okay, makes sense. As you are a historian, difference between the now and then, pre-colonial and the contemporary society. You might have seen how Dalit have organized themselves and challenged caste discrimination over the time. And what are the key strategies and movements have been instrumental in advancing their rights and representation?
So again, I would maybe divide that into two parts. One would be the pre-colonial, right, before modernity, before colonialism, and the other would be in the colonial era and onwards. So pre-colonial period, I would say that there are many examples of ways in which Dalits have resisted. So one is, and I show this in my book, is the language of custom. So in Marwari, that's the language in which my sources are, the words for custom which are overlapping with Hindi would be reeth. One is overlaps with Persian is wajib. The third is siraste and sadamand su. Okay. So these are the words that are used in petitions by lower caste groups, including groups we would today put in untouchable, in the sort of Dalit label, that can come to the state and say that so and so is oppressing us or denying us this customary right or taxing us extra or even excluding us from a certain space like a ritual space or a festival, which are the others you could say are economic oppressions, although economic oppressions are a part of caste oppression. But even these kinds of spatial and distance creating discriminations, Dalit groups come to the state and say this is a violation of custom, and that can serve as a powerful resource in this legal order, where custom does carry a lot of weight, and custom is recognized as variable. So the custom in my village may be very different from the custom in your village, and that is fine as long as you can show that this was a custom in my village, and now I'm being denied this right. So custom was a powerful resource. Then we have actually examples of strikes, like of people refusing to work. Not in a factory. Obviously, there's no large scale coming together of workers as we would have in a factory setting. But even in like isolated ways, they might say, we don't want to pay this tax, and if you make us pay the tax, we won't work. There is the option of flight. We will leave. We simply go. We get up and go. So those are some examples of action oriented resistance. Then there's the question, the sort of the questioning of the very ideology of caste, right? That we see in strands of bhakti poetry, bhakti or like devotional, right? Some of which was kind of which imagined sort of God in a as one, right? And sometimes as an abstract, formless, like there's no statue, there's no object that we worship. There's an abstract idea. So in a lot of the bhakti poetry, we find a total rejection of Brahminical inequalities or Brahminical caste, of Brahminical ritual. We find a total rejection also of like even Hindu Muslim kind of you could call it kattarpana, or like being very strict about ritual and what are represented in bhakti thinking as superficial. These people are obsessing over the things that are not the real way to worship God. So in that finding of a different relationship to God, there is a pushback against the very idea and the practice of caste that we definitely see to some extent in pre-colonial India. And I think then coming to colonial India, of course, there are all kinds of new dynamics, new ideals, new values, new methods and modes of communication that are introduced. And we see Dalits move in and assert themselves through all of those means. So whether it is through using print, whether it is through forming associations, whether it is through, taking on this language of satyagraha that we see initially with Ambedkar and his kind of intervention in temple entry and water access, which were ways in which Dalits were excluded. Then we see this recognition that perhaps there is no caste justice within the fold of Hinduism. So kind of a rejection of Hinduism and an embrace, for example, of Buddhism. As led by Dr. Ambedkar. So that strategy is yet another prong through which there is a kind of a rejection of the caste order by Dalits. Then there is the turn to the state, to legal protections and legal affirmative interventions. So that is a plank. Obviously, the outlawing of like caste-based discrimination is a major step forward. Again, all this is to say that while there is resistance, forms of oppression continue. It's not that the resistance has become successful, right? But at the same time, since your question was about, what are the ways in which Dalits have resisted, again, it's a whole range from intellectual, political, cultural, and here this I didn't mention, but there are cultural groups, musical groups, theater, etc., cinema, so cultural. Economic forms of organization. So really, it's a panoply that Dalits have exercised in the modern age and the pre-colonial I already mentioned.
Yeah, so the bottom line is people like you and us can work for caste and caste discrimination, because we cannot isolate our in the caste discrimination in any area of South Asia or any part of the world. With that, it was pleasure talking to you, Divya, and I really appreciate your work and what you presented. You are such a brilliant mind, to be very honest, and it was really a fascinating conversation with you.
Thank you. If I can just quickly jump in, I didn't mean to say it can't be isolated in any part of the world. I was just trying to say first we must start with the self and our everyday way of being in the world. And it's a constant thing. We may fail, we may mess up, but it's something we try. It's a quest, and that was just one of the things. But thank you so much for the kind words once again, and for having me speak at your forum, and all the best to SARIM for the work that it is doing.